The man sneered. You think you've won? You think you can just stop me? Lila met his gaze with newfound resolve. I'm not trying to win. I'm just trying to survive. We all are. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, but the power that had once seemed overwhelming, suffocating, no longer felt so heavy. She could feel the shift, the change in the way her body responded to the world around her. She was in control now, not of time, but of herself. She had stopped running. A distant sound interrupted the silence. A sharp crack, the unmistakable sound of something shifting, something breaking. The ground beneath them trembled slightly, a subtle reminder of the power at play here. The trees around them rustled, and the air grew colder. The man's sneer faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion. What's happening? He demanded, his voice growing tight. Lila felt it too, this change in the atmosphere. Something was shifting. Something was breaking. Time, the boy said softly, his eyes narrowing. Something is wrong with time. We've pushed it too far. Lila's mind raced as the boy's words sank in. This wasn't just about them, about their powers. It was about everything. Time itself had been manipulated beyond its natural boundaries, and now it was starting to fracture. The man, sensing the same disturbance, took a step backward, his eyes darting around. This isn't how it's supposed to happen. You're both fools? But before he could make another move, the ground beneath them split. A jagged crack tore through the park, sending tremors that shook them to their core. Leela gasped as the world seemed to bend, to warp in a way she couldn't understand. "We have to get out of here!" the boy shouted, pulling Leela toward him. Leela's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. The world was coming undone, and they had no time to waste. She could feel it, the power of time unraveling, the chaos they had created now consuming everything. The boy was right. Time had been twisted, and now they were all at its mercy. Together, they ran. The man, however, was not as quick to react. For a moment, Leela almost felt sorry for him. He had been so certain of his own power, so sure that he could control everything, but now he was just as helpless as they were. As the ground split further, a deep chasm opening between them, the man scrambled backward, shouting in fury and frustration. But Lila didn't look back. She couldn't. She didn't know where they were running, only that they needed to move, needed to escape. The park, once a place of serenity, had become a battleground. Time itself was their enemy, and nothing was certain. As they reached the edge of the park, Lila finally stopped, her legs burning from the exertion. She turned to look at the boy, whose face was flushed with fear and determination. "We have to fix this," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We have to set things right." The boy nodded, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. "I know, but how?" Lila's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. They had already pushed time to its breaking point. She had stopped it, bent it, and now she was paying the price. But what if they could reverse it? What if they could restore the balance before it all collapsed? The man's voice broke through her thoughts, low and menacing. "You can't undo what's been done. It's over." Lila's heart hammered in her chest, but she stood tall, her hands trembling but steady. "Maybe it's over for you," she said softly, turning to face him. "But not for us." The boy's eyes met hers, and she could see it, the same determination, the same understanding. They couldn't stop time completely, but they could try to restore it. They could reset the balance, undo the damage they had caused. With one final look, the man let out a guttural growl of frustration, his eyes dark and filled with rage. But the world had already shifted. He was already being pulled into the chaos, his presence fading as the fabric of time twisted around them. And then the park was still. It wasn't until she heard it, the sound of footsteps, that she froze in place. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that she was afraid of the dark or of being alone in the park. She had walked these paths countless times. It was the feeling that someone else was here, someone who shouldn't be, someone who was very much alive. Her eyes flickered to the source of the sound. At first she couldn't make out anything, just a figure moving through the shadows, walking toward her. But the steps, there was something off about them. The person was moving in the way someone does when they're unsure of where they're going, almost stumbling. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She knew the park was almost always empty this late, especially on weeknights. Everyone else was either home or working. But there it was, another person. Another living being, someone who seemed entirely out of place. For a moment, she felt a rush of panic flood her chest. Was this a sign? Had someone noticed her, followed her here, seen her stop time? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. But before she could decide what to do, the figure drew closer, emerging from the shadows into the soft light of the nearest lamppost. Lila gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a boy, no older than she was, dressed in dark clothes, his hair messy and falling into his eyes. His face looked pale, as though he hadn't seen the sun in days. He was staring at her, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and desperation, as if he were trying to place her. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Then the boy took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely a whisper in the stillness. "Are you real?" Lila blinked, her heart thudded in her chest. The world felt as if it had tilted on its axis. She wasn't sure why, but the boy's question sent a jolt of recognition through her. Something about him felt strange, out of place, as though he too were a part of the same forgotten world she was drifting into. "Yes, I am," she finally replied, her voice shaking. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "Are you?" The boy's eyes darted around the park, as if expecting someone to jump out at him. "I don't know anymore," he murmured. "I don't remember who I am." Lila's breath caught in her throat. A strange chill ran down her spine. Was this some kind of dream? She could feel a surge of empathy for him, a deep, unspoken understanding. She didn't know what had happened to him, but she knew that look. She had felt it in herself. A disconnection, a drifting away from the person she used to be. "How did you get here?" she asked cautiously, taking a step back, unsure if she should stay or run. The boy hesitated. "Ah! I think I've been here a long time." He took another step toward her, eyes pleading. "But I can't remember anything. It's like pieces of me are missing, like I'm fading away. Do you understand?" Lila felt her heart squeeze painfully in her chest. She wanted to pull away, to ignore this bizarre encounter, but something held her in place. She wanted to tell him that she understood. How could she not? She too had begun to lose pieces of herself, but she couldn't say the words. Not yet. The pain of it all was too fresh. "I think I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've been losing things too." The boy's eyes softened, and for a moment Leela thought he might reach out for her, but instead he took a deep breath and looked down at the ground. "I don't know what's happening," he muttered, almost to himself. "I don't know what to do anymore." The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Lila could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She wanted to speak, to ask him more questions, but the strange pull between them was too strong, too unsettling. This wasn't just some random person in the park. There was something else going on, something that tied them together in a way she couldn't explain. The world around her froze, the figures around her becoming statues, their outstretched hands halted in midair. But as Lila stood there, breathing heavily, she felt it, the familiar emptiness creeping into her mind. Another memory was slipping away, and this time it felt like it might be the last one she had left. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the frozen figures, her hand trembling as she took a step back. What had she just done? Time hung suspended in the air as Lila stood frozen in the middle of the park, surrounded by the figures who had threatened her. She could feel the familiar pull of the power, the crushing weight that came with halting the world around her. Every muscle in her body was tense, every nerve alert, as if time itself were holding its breath. She looked at the man, his hand still stretched toward her, suspended in midair. The other figures stood motionless, frozen as well, their eyes locked in place. She had done it again. She had stopped time just like before. But this time, something was different. The silence was deafening. The emptiness inside her grew louder, as if her memories were screaming at her to stop. Lila's breath came in shallow gasps. How many more times could I do this? She thought desperately. How many more memories could I lose before there's nothing left of me? Her heart pounded, and the gnawing fear she had been pushing away now overwhelmed her. She had only stopped time to escape, to protect herself. But now, standing here in the quiet, knowing the consequences, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She had to make a choice. The boy. The one who had been with them stood in the distance, still frozen like the others. His face was pale, his expression a mix of fear and regret. She had seen that same fear in herself, that same uncertainty. He hadn't known what he was getting into, just like her, but now it was too late. Could I even help him? Lila's fingers trembled as she reached out to him. But then a deeper feeling stirred within her, a sharp, cold realization. The boy wasn't the only one at risk here. The others, the group who had confronted her, weren't just strangers. They were like her, time manipulators, each carrying their own burden. And now they were here, and they knew what she was capable of. Her mind raced. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep hiding from what she had done. The boy, she thought. The others. She was the one who had to face them, not just for her own sake, but for theirs too. Lila's breath caught. She had spent so long avoiding confrontation, staying in the shadows, too afraid of what would happen if she faced her powers head-on. But now, standing at the precipice of losing everything, she realized that she couldn't run anymore. It wasn't just about her memories, it was about the future, her future, and the future of everyone who had touched her life. Her hand hovered over the group, and she hesitated. What if I stop time again? What if I can't bring it back? But the question that echoed in her mind was sharper than any fear. What if I don't? With a deep, shuddering breath, Lila made her decision. She would stop running. She would face this. She would not let herself fall into the abyss. And then, with an act of will, she released time. The park burst back to life with a rush. The wind swept through the trees, leaves rustling in its wake. The figures around her began to move again, the man's arm falling to his side with a soft thud. His eyes flickered, focusing on her in an instant. Lila's heart raced as the reality of her choice hit her. The man's gaze locked onto hers, dark and calculating. "You shouldn't have done that," he warned, his voice sharp and low. "Now you've made it worse." She didn't reply. Instead, she looked over at the boy, the one who had been caught in this web with her. His eyes were wide, and for the first time she saw a flicker of understanding in them. She wasn't alone anymore. She couldn't run from this. Neither could he. "Do you—" Lila began, then stopped herself. She had almost asked if he had the same ability, the same power, but she didn't know how to explain it to him. How could she? The idea sounded insane, even to her. Instead, she just shook her head, the words dying in her throat. "You should go home," she said, her voice tight with emotion. You're not alone." The boy looked at her with a mixture of confusion and longing, as if searching for something in her that would make sense of the chaotic, fragmented thoughts spinning in his head. But after a long pause, he nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I will." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lila standing in the growing darkness, her mind racing. What had just happened? Had she imagined the whole thing? But the strange sense of déjà vu, the disorienting feeling that lingered, told her it was real. And the way he had looked at her, so lost, so unsure, it felt like a mirror, reflecting the exact emotions she had been struggling with. Lila stood there, rooted to the spot, her thoughts swirling. The world around her seemed to shift, the normalcy of the night now tainted by a sense of unease. The power she had once embraced now felt more like a curse. Something was happening. Something bigger than her, and for the first time, she wondered if it was too late to turn back. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The encounter with the boy had left her rattled. She walked home in a daze, each step heavy, as though her feet were dragging through thick mud. The park, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt tainted by the boy's presence. His words echoed in her mind. "I don't remember who I am." Lila knew what that felt like. Her memories were slipping away, pieces of herself vanishing like smoke in the wind. But there was something about him, something she couldn't place. She had to know more. She had to find him again. The next day, she found herself back in the park, her pulse racing with anticipation. She had searched the area where she'd met him last night, but he was gone. The park was quieter now, more ordinary in the daylight. The leaves rustled with the wind. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the distant playground. And yet, she felt the same gnawing emptiness. Lila's fingers twitched with the urge to stop time, to erase the frustration, to search the park without the restrictions of the ticking clock. But she held back. What would it cost her this time? Another piece of herself? She didn't know how much she could afford to lose. "Lila?" Her breath hitched, and she turned to see Kate, her best friend, walking toward her, a concerned look on her face. Lila smiled weakly, trying to push the unease away. "Hey, Kate," Lila greeted, forcing the tension out of her voice. Kate raised an eyebrow. "You look off. What's going on? You've been acting weird lately." Lila's mind raced. She couldn't tell Kate the truth. No one would believe her. Not about the power to stop time, and certainly not about the boy who seemed to have the same fragments of memories slipping through his fingers. She couldn't risk it. She needed to keep it all together, keep her life as normal as possible. "I'm fine," Lila said, offering a small smile. "Just tired. Tired." Kate didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. "All right, well, I'll catch you later." "Yeah," Lila replied, and watched as Kate walked off, the worry still evident on her face. Lila couldn't blame her. She knew she was hiding something, but she couldn't risk losing control. She couldn't let anyone get too close. The clock ticked, its soft, rhythmic sound echoing through the room like a pulse. And yet, it wasn't the clock that controlled time anymore. It was her. It had started innocently enough, like any other unremarkable day. But Lila knew. Deep down, something had shifted. She had always felt different, like there was something more to her, something that couldn't be explained. And now she knew. She had discovered it just a few days ago during a routine walk through the park. She had been angry, frustrated really, by how her friends were treating her. It wasn't that they meant to be cruel, but their indifference stung. It always did. She had been in the middle of a conversation with Kate, her best friend, when the world had suddenly frozen. The leaves in the trees hung motionless, the breeze was trapped in mid-air, and people, cars, animals, all of them stood as if caught in a snapshot of time. The sensation was almost dizzying. But what amazed her the most was how silent it was. No hum of the city, no distant chatter, nothing. Her heart had pounded in her chest, but everything else around her was utterly still. She felt the power. She had no idea how or why it had happened, but she had done it. She had stopped time, and it had been beautiful. She had been alone in the world, free to do anything, free from the burden of the constant ticking of the clock. But the second she had made her way to a nearby bench, a strange, eerie sensation crept over her. Something had slipped away, a memory, a small one, but it was gone. She couldn't recall the conversation she'd had just before time stopped. She could no longer picture the day before clearly. The details felt hazy, distant. It had only been moments, but the loss was unmistakable. It was then she realized the price. Every time she stopped time, she would lose a memory. At first, it was something small. The name of the street she had walked down just moments before. The way her mother had smiled at her that morning. But then it started to get worse. The memories faded faster, slipping through her fingers like sand. And worse, the gaps in her mind started to create a disorienting emptiness. There were moments when she couldn't remember the faces of the people she loved, the moments they had shared. Who was that? Why did she feel like she should remember? But the faces always blurred, no matter how hard she tried to focus. And so she had stopped. But that wasn't the end. The temptation to stop time again, the allure of being in complete control, was far too strong. She was just a teenager after all, an insecure, restless teenager who was still figuring out who she was and what she wanted to be. The possibility of having control, even for a few moments, was intoxicating. But she had learned quickly that there were consequences. The more she stopped time, the more memories she lost. And the gaps, they grew deeper, more significant. What had started with fleeting memories soon became whole chunks of her life that were simply gone. She tried to hold on to the moments. She did. But every time she stopped time, it was like an empty void swept in, taking something precious. Her childhood best friend's birthday party? Gone. The exact words her mother had said the last time they had dinner together? Vanished. The feeling of lying in bed on a quiet Sunday morning, hearing the birds chirp outside her window? Just a hazy outline of a memory, with no clear details to fill it in. Lila couldn't help it. She had always been curious, always wanted to push boundaries, to see how far she could go. When she found out she could stop time, she thought she had found the ultimate freedom, the perfect escape from the monotony of her life. But now she was beginning to realize that the world she had frozen was not hers to control, and the price she was paying for it was far too high. Eventually the boy turned to her. Do you think there's any way to make time work again? To fix it once and for all? Lila thought for a long moment, her mind racing through the possibilities. The world was fractured. Time had bent in ways that no one could fully understand. But the thing she had learned most in these past days was that control wasn't everything. Sometimes survival meant surrender. Sometimes it meant accepting the things that couldn't be changed. I don't know, she said quietly, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we just need to find a new way to live in this world, a way to live with time instead of trying to control it. The boy looked at her, his expression a mix of doubt and curiosity. You really think we can do that? Live with it? Lila's gaze shifted to the horizon again. The world stretched out before them, vast and unknown, filled with possibilities both frightening and wondrous. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't need to. What mattered was that they had made it this far, and they would keep going, whatever came next. I think we can try, she said softly. We can't go back, but we can move forward. The boy smiled, a small, genuine smile. Yeah, I think we can. Together they began walking away from the broken park, their steps slow but determined. Lila felt the weight of what they had endured, of the sacrifices they had made, but she also felt something else, something lighter. It was the quiet realization that they weren't alone anymore. Not in this world, not in the chaos they had created. They had each other, and that was more than enough. As they walked, the world around them seemed to take a deep breath. The air grew less tense, the ground beneath them less unstable. Time might still be fractured, but it wasn't the end. It was a beginning of something new. The boy's voice broke the silence again, this time softer, more reflective. Do you think we'll ever figure it out? How to make time work again, I mean? Lila paused, her eyes lifting to the sky. It was a question that had no easy answer, but it didn't need one. Maybe not, she said quietly. Maybe we don't need to figure it out. Maybe we just need to live with the pieces we've got. He didn't respond immediately, but his face softened, as if her words had settled somewhere deep inside him. Together they continued walking forward, no longer bound by the weight of their past, but embracing whatever lay ahead. The world was broken, yes, but it was also full of potential. Time might be fractured, but they could learn to live within its fractures, to make something beautiful from the shards. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in soft twilight, Lila understood something else. Sometimes the greatest journey wasn't about fixing the world around you. It was about learning to live with it and finding peace in the chaos. As they disappeared into the distance, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what came next. But Lila, for the first time, was no longer afraid. The end had become a new beginning. Why are you doing this? Lila asked, her voice stronger now. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't afraid to face them. The man laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was bitter, laced with disdain. You really don't get it, do you? We've been watching you for a long time. You think you can just play with time? It's not a game, girl. We all pay the price. Lila took a step back, her mind spinning. The man's words pierced her like 1,000 needles. We all pay the price. What did that mean? What had she done? What had they done? You've already lost so much, the man continued. I've seen it in your eyes. You're not the same girl you were when you first started messing with time. We're here to stop you before it's too late. Lila clenched her fists. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She was going to let him control her anymore. What if I don't want to be stopped? She shot back, her voice trembling with fury. What if I want to find a way to fix it? The man's smile twisted. You can't fix what's broken, not when it's already too late. With a sudden movement, he lunged toward her, and Lila's heart leapt into her throat. She wasn't fast enough to react. He was upon her, his hand gripping her arm tightly. The world around her seemed to close in, her vision blurring with panic. But then something unexpected happened. The boy, the one who had been standing off to the side, finally moved. His eyes, filled with a wild desperation, locked onto the man's form. Without a word, he sprinted toward them, his hand reaching out, his fingers crackling with an energy Lila had never seen before. "Get away from her!" the boy shouted, his voice raw with emotion. He pushed the man away with a force that sent him staggering back. Lila's heart skipped. He has powers too? She barely had time to process it before the man recovered, fury flashing in his eyes. "Foolish boy," he snarled. "You don't know what you're doing." Lila's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. She wasn't the only one with this ability. The boy had it too. But what was his story? Why had he come to the park in the first place? Without thinking, Lila stepped forward. She reached out and grabbed the boy's arm. "We have to stick together," she said urgently. "We can't fight him alone." The boy looked at her, his eyes wide with fear and hope. "I don't know what's happening, but I'll fight with you." With that, they turned together, facing the man and the rest of the group. Time was running out, and the stakes had never been higher. In that moment, Lila realized the true cost of their powers, not just the loss of memories, but the loss of control. The choice they made now would determine everything. Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the man staggered back. The world seemed to quiet around her, the energy shifting, the tension lifting in a slow release. She and the boy were now standing side by side, the weight of the moment settling over them like a heavy fog. The man, the one who had threatened them both, was still recovering from the boy's unexpected intervention. "You shouldn't have done that," the man hissed, his voice a mixture of fury and disbelief. But his words felt hollow, like the last gasps of a dying storm. Lila could see it now. The cracks in his control, the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He wasn't as invincible as he had seemed moments before. The boy, still gripping her arm, looked over at her, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps, his wide eyes locked with hers. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Lila could sense the raw emotion in his voice, fear, concern, and something else. Something that reminded her of the fear she had carried for so long, the fear of losing everything. She nodded slowly, her voice shaky but strong. "I'm fine, I'm not afraid anymore." The boy seemed to relax slightly at her words, though his grip on her arm remained firm, like he needed her support just as much as she needed his. They both faced the man now, standing together against whatever came next. With Kate gone, Lila returned her focus to the park, scanning the area for any sign of the boy. She walked the familiar path toward the bench where she'd met him, hoping for a glimpse of the dark-haired figure. But the park was empty, save for a few elderly people walking their dogs and a couple of joggers passing by. The place felt eerily deserted. And then she heard it. A faint, barely audible sound like a whisper coming from behind the trees. Lila's heart raced. She moved toward the sound, her footsteps quickening as her curiosity pulled her forward. As she rounded the corner of the path, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, standing in the shadows of the trees, was the boy. But he wasn't alone. A group of figures stood with him, their faces obscured by the darkness. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The boy's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something in them. Something frantic. A warning. He seemed to be trying to say something, but no words came out. His lips moved, but the sound was drowned by the crackle of the trees in the wind. Then the figures surrounding him began to move, slowly, deliberately toward her. Lila's instincts kicked in. She knew she had to leave, but her legs were frozen, her body refusing to obey. The boy looked desperate now, his face twisted with panic. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know what was happening either. The first figure stepped forward, a tall silhouette against the dimming light. Lila tried to turn and run, but before she could move, a voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "You're not going anywhere." Lila froze, her heart racing as she turned slowly to face the voice. The man who had spoken was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially concealed by a dark hood. He looked ordinary enough, until you saw the glint of something dark and dangerous in his eyes. "What do you want?" Lila demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound confident. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the boy, who was now backing away, looking more and more like a trapped animal. Lila's eyes darted between them, confusion and fear mounting. "She's dangerous," the man finally said, his voice low and threatening. We can't let her control time. Lila's stomach dropped. Her mind raced. Control time? How did he know? How could he possibly know? The boy's eyes widened, his lips trembling. I didn't know it would be like this. I didn't know. He broke off, his voice cracking. The look in his eyes was one of absolute terror, and for the first time, Lila saw the same fear she had felt when she had first discovered her power. The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing on Lila. You're not the only one who can do this, you know. There are more of us, more who've learned the price of tampering with time. And you. He pointed at her with a gloved finger. You need to stop before it's too late. Lila's breath hitched. Who are you? The man didn't answer. Instead, the other figures around him closed in, moving with swift, coordinated steps. It was as if they had been waiting for her, watching her all along. Panic gripped her chest. She glanced back at the boy, whose face was now a mask of despair. This wasn't what she had expected. She had thought she was alone in this strange, twisted world of time manipulation, but now she realized she wasn't. There were others, and they were dangerous. A surge of adrenaline pushed Lila into action. She didn't know if she could stop time again without losing another piece of herself, but she had no choice. She had to try. Before she could make her move, the man lunged toward her, his hand reaching for her arm. In that instant, something within her snapped. Time stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. The earth beneath them seemed to hold its breath. Time had not been completely restored, but it had been paused, stilled, like a wound that hadn't yet healed but had stopped bleeding. Lila took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world settle onto her shoulders. The boy, still standing beside her, seemed to relax, though there was an undeniable sadness in his eyes. I don't know what happens next, he said, his voice soft, but we made it through, together. Lila nodded, the reality of what they had just survived slowly sinking in. They had faced the impossible and won, if only just, and yet the price had been high, for her, for the boy, for everyone who had been caught in the crossfire. But in this moment, standing together, she could almost believe that they had the strength to rebuild, to fix what had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make time work for them. Lila stood at the edge of the park, the boy by her side, both of them feeling the heavy silence settle over them like an unwelcome fog. The world around them was still, almost eerily so. The crack in the earth where the man had fallen seemed to pulse like a living thing, as if the ground itself were uncertain whether to heal or to remain broken. We did it, Lila said, though the words felt hollow, not entirely real. Had they truly fixed time? Had they undone the damage they had caused? Or was this just another moment suspended in the endless chaos of possibility? The boy didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the scene with an intensity that Lila couldn't quite place. His face was drawn, exhausted, and yet there was something softer about him now, something more vulnerable. It had been a long time since she'd seen anyone so human. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice thick with hesitation. I think we've stopped it for now, but I don't know what's going to happen next. Time might still be broken in ways we can't see. Lila turned away, looking out at the horizon. The sun, which had hung heavy in the sky just hours before, now seemed distant and weak, as if unsure whether it should continue to shine. There was an unsettled feeling in the air, a quiet unease that whispered of the dangers that still lay ahead. She had always felt out of control, like everything in her life had been one step ahead, just beyond her grasp. But now, in this moment, she realized something. The boy was right. Time had been broken, and it might never be the same. But that didn't mean they had failed. They had made it through. They had faced the impossible and survived. Maybe we don't need to fix everything, Lila said softly, more to herself than to the boy. Maybe the important thing is learning how to live with it. The boy nodded slowly. His eyes flickered toward the horizon as if considering her words, but then he turned to her with a tentative smile. You've changed. I can see it. You're not the same person who was running before. Leela blinked, caught off guard by the observation. She had never really thought about who she was before everything had happened. But standing there, with the boy at her side, facing the unknown together, she understood. She had been running, not just from time, but from herself, from the fear of being trapped, of being powerless. But now, in the midst of chaos, she felt something different, a sense of agency, a sense of peace. She wasn't running anymore. "I'm not," she agreed, her voice steady, "and I'm not going back." They both fell silent then, the weight of the moment sinking in as they stood together in the stillness of the broken park. There was no grand resolution, no fireworks or celebration. There was only this quiet, uncertain peace. But peace was still something. She could still feel the remnants of those memories, scattered and disconnected, like pieces of a broken mirror. Her fingers twitched as if she could reach out and piece them all back together. But the harder she tried, the more they slipped away. And what made it worse was the nagging feeling that she was losing parts of herself. The worst part was that she had no one to talk to, no one would understand. What could she say? "Hey, I can stop time, but every time I do, I lose a piece of myself." No one would believe her. They would think she was crazy. Or worse, they'd say it was all in her head. Lila's gaze drifted out the window of her room, where the sun was setting. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, a perfect, tranquil moment that would have made her feel at peace if she hadn't been tormented by the loss of her own memories. The sound of the clock on the wall ticked again, but it no longer seemed to matter. Her parents, for all their good intentions, never noticed the distance growing between them. They were so wrapped up in their own lives. She was fine, they thought. It's just a phase. But it wasn't just a phase. Lila had become a stranger to herself. She didn't know who she was anymore. The memories she clung to, the ones that made her feel grounded, were becoming blurred. Her past was slipping from her fingertips like water through a sieve. Each memory she lost took away a piece of her identity. She could still remember what it felt like to be happy. She had a vague, warm sense of it. But could she remember the last time she truly laughed? Could she recall the last time she'd felt completely understood by someone? No, she couldn't. And what terrified her most was the growing fear that the more she used this power, the more she would fade into oblivion, become a mere echo of herself. A shadow. Her fingers hovered over the clock again. The desire to stop time was overwhelming. The possibilities it opened up were endless. But what would it cost this time? What piece of herself would she lose next? Lila clenched her fists in frustration. She had to stop. But the temptation to control everything, to be in charge, to freeze the world for just a little longer, was too great. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold back. And as she stood there, in the fading light of the day, she knew one thing. The path she was walking was taking her to a place she couldn't predict. And the cost? She feared it would be greater than anything she could bear. Lila was standing at the edge of the park, her feet numb from standing still too long. The familiar streetlights flickered on, casting long golden shadows over the paths she had walked 1,000 times. She had decided, after days of trying to push her power to the back of her mind, that tonight would be the night she would stop time again. It had been weeks and the pressure was mounting. The need to feel that weightlessness, to be in complete control, just for a moment, was overwhelming. But tonight, something felt different. The usual peace that accompanied her quiet walks had evaporated, leaving a gnawing restlessness in its place. The air was thick with an eerie quiet, as though the world itself was waiting for something to happen. The trees swayed gently, their branches scraping against each other in a sound that made her skin prickle. Everything seemed off. Lila glanced around nervously, her fingers twitching at her side as she considered the option. She could stop time, just for a minute. She could take a breath, let the silence of the world wrap around her, and forget for a while. But then her mind raced back to the consequences, the memory losses, the way it had begun to feel like pieces of her were fading into oblivion. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going like this.